The summer of 1852 came to the village of Saint-Étienne-de-Bois like a fever itself. The sun burned too bright over the wheat fields. The air hung heavy and still. In the grand estate that sat on the hill above the village, two boys lay dying in the same bed, their small bodies burning with the sickness that had already taken 3 children from the baker's family. Henri and Marcel Lavoie were 8 years old. They had been born on the same winter night, under the same cold stars. They shared the same dark hair, the same green eyes, the same way of tilting their heads when they listened. Even their mother, Celeste, sometimes found it hard to tell them apart in the dim light of evening. But fever makes choices that mothers cannot bear to make. Dr. Moreau came to the estate every day for 2 weeks. His black bag grew heavier each time he climbed the stone steps to the front door. He would examine both boys with gentle hands and tired eyes. Henri, the weaker of the twins, burned hotter. His breathing came in small, quick gasps. Marcel, though sick, still opened his eyes when spoken to, still reached for his mother's hand. Madame Lavoie, the doctor said on a Tuesday morning in July. His voice carried the weight of too many similar conversations. We must prepare ourselves. The fever has taken hold too strongly. Celeste stood by the tall window of the boys' room. She watched the village below, where other mothers hung laundry in the sun and called their living children home for lunch. Her hands pressed flat against the glass. "Which one?" she whispered. The doctor removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth that had seen too much sorrow. "Henri's lungs are filling. His heart struggles. Marcel might survive if the fever breaks." That night, Celeste sat between the twin beds. She held Henri's burning hand in her left palm, Marcel's cooler fingers in her right. The moon cast silver light across their faces, making them look like sleeping angels. For hours, she watched them breathe. Henri's chest rose and fell with effort. Marcel slept deeply, his breathing steady. A mother's heart can break in ways that leave no visible scars. When dawn touched the windows, Henri's breathing had stopped. Celeste felt his small hand grow cold in hers. Marcel stirred but did not wake. The choice had been made by something larger than human love. But Celeste Lavoie was not ready to let the choice stand. She carried Henri's still body down to the cellar. Her tears fell on the stone steps as she walked. In the deepest room, behind walls thick enough to muffle sound, she laid her son on a bed of old quilts. His skin was pale, but not yet cold. His lips still held the faintest color. She pressed her ear to his chest and heard nothing. She held a mirror to his mouth and saw no breath cloud the glass. But a mother's hope can see what doctors cannot. Celeste brought blankets and food. She brought water and medicine. She brought oil lamps to chase away the darkness. She locked the cellar door and hid the key in her jewelry box beneath the pearl necklace her own mother had worn. Upstairs, she placed pillows and old clothes in Henri's bed. She pulled the sheet over what looked like a small body. When Dr. Moreau arrived that morning, she met him at the door with red eyes and a breaking voice. "Henri passed in the night," she told him. Peacefully. The doctor nodded with sad understanding. He had seen this too many times. And Marcel, his fever broke at sunrise. He will live. The funeral was held 3 days later. The bell tower of Saint-Étienne-de-Bois rang 13 times, once for each year the church had stood, as was tradition for children called home too soon. Marcel, weak but recovering, watched from the upstairs window as a small coffin was carried from the estate to the cemetery. He pressed his face to the glass and wept for his brother. The coffin was filled with stones. Celeste stood in black beside the grave as Father Dubois spoke words about angels and eternal rest. The villagers offered their sympathy with gentle touches and whispered prayers. They remembered Henri as the quieter twin, the one who picked flour for his mother and fed bread crusts to the sparrows. But in the cellar beneath their feet, something impossible was happening. Henri's chest began to rise again on the second day. His breathing came shallow and weak, like a bird with a broken wing. His eyes opened on the third day, confused and frightened by the darkness around him. He called for his mother in a voice like rustling leaves. Celeste came to him with soup and soft words. She bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths. She sang the lullabies she had sung when he and Marcel were babies. But she could not explain why he was alone in the dark, why Marcel's bed was empty, why the world above had forgotten him. "Where is Marcel?" Henri whispered. "He is safe," Celeste answered. "He is healing. Why can't I see him?" Celeste's heart broke again in new places. "You are still very sick, my darling. You must rest here until you are strong." But Henri grew stronger each day. He asked more questions. He cried for his brother. He begged to go upstairs, to see the sun, to play in the garden where he and Marcel had chased butterflies just weeks before. Celeste brought him books and toys. She brought him food and clean clothes. But she could not bring him the truth. How could she explain that the village believed he was dead? How could she tell him that his own funeral had been held, that flowers had been placed on a grave with his name carved in stone? Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The cellar became Henry's entire world. Marcel, recovering upstairs, asked about his brother every day. Celeste told him that Henri was at peace, that he watched over them from heaven, that someday they would be together again. Marcel placed flowers on Henry's grave each Sunday after church. He talked to the headstone as if his twin could hear him. But sometimes, late at night, Marcel thought he heard footsteps in the walls. He thought he heard someone crying in a voice that sounded like his own. The secret grew like a cancer in Celeste's heart. She began to lose weight. Her hair turned gray. She spoke little and smiled less. The villagers whispered that grief had broken the lady of the estate, that losing a child had stolen her reason. They were not wrong. As autumn painted the leaves gold and red, Henri learned to move quietly through his underground prison. He learned which stones in the walls were loose, which boards in the ceiling creaked when someone walked above. He learned that if he pressed his ear to the door, he could sometimes hear his mother's voice in the distance. But he could never hear Marcel. The choice that was meant to save one son had condemned them both, one to a life without his brother, one to a life without the world. And Celeste Lavoie, who had thought love could conquer death itself, discovered that some choices echo through time like church bells, marking not just the hours, but the weight of what can never be undone. The autumn of 1866 settled over Saint-Étienne-de-Bois like dust over a forgotten grave. The leaves had turned brown and fallen. The harvest was done. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and coming winter. Marcel Lavoie stepped down from the coach that had brought him from Paris. He was 22 now, tall and lean, with the same green eyes that had once reflected his twin brother's face. But 14 years had carved lines around those eyes. 14 years of living while Henri slept beneath the earth. The estate looked like a house that had been holding its breath too long. The windows were boarded with planks that had weathered gray. Ivy had crawled up the stone walls, reaching toward windows that would never again see light. The iron gates hung crooked on their hinges. The garden where two boys had once chased butterflies was now a wild tangle of weeds and thorns. Marcel carried a single leather bag and a letter from the bank in Paris. The letter spoke of debts and taxes, of property that must be sold to pay what his mother had left behind. Celeste Lavoie had died the previous winter, taking her secrets to a grave beside the son she had buried twice, once in truth, once in lies. The villagers watched from their windows as Marcel walked up the stone path to the front door. They whispered among themselves about the cursed estate, about the lady who had lost her mind after losing her child, about the son who had fled to Paris and never returned. They whispered, but they did not approach. Marcel found the key where his mother had always hidden it, beneath the loose stone by the kitchen door. The lock turned with a sound like breaking bones. The door opened on rooms that had tasted no fresh air for 2 years. The house smelled of decay and silence. Dust covered everything like a fine gray snow. The furniture stood draped in white sheets, making the rooms look like a gathering of ghosts. Marcel's footsteps echoed on floors that remembered the sound of children running, of a mother's careful steps, of all the daily sounds that make a house feel alive. But as Marcel walked through the rooms of his childhood, he began to notice things that did not belong in an abandoned house. In the kitchen, Crumbs scattered the table where no one had eaten for years. In the parlor, the chair by the fireplace bore the impression of a body, as if someone had recently risen from sleep. In his mother's room, the bed was unmade, the pillow still holding the shape of a head. Marcel stood in the doorway of his old room, the room he had shared with Henri until that terrible summer when fever had taken half his world away. The twin beds still sat side by side, covered in dust and memories. But one bed showed signs of use. Rumpled sheets, a depression in the mattress, as if someone had been lying there, dreaming dreams that belonged to the dead. The rational mind that Marcel had built during his years in Paris offered explanations. Perhaps his mother had used the room in her final months. Perhaps servants had taken shelter here during storms. Perhaps vagrants had found their way inside. But the rational mind could not explain the footprints in the dust. They were small prints, like those of a child or a very thin man. They led from room to room in patterns that made no sense, from the kitchen to the parlor, from the parlor up the stairs, from the stairs down to the cellar door. The cellar door that Marcel remembered being locked for as long as he could remember. The cellar door that now stood slightly open. Marcel took an oil lamp from the kitchen. His hand shook as he lit the wick. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the house seem more alive and more dead at the same time. He followed the footprints down the main hallway, past the portraits of ancestors who stared with painted eyes that seemed to follow his movement. At the cellar door, Marcel paused. The wood was old and thick, carved from oak that had stood in these forests for centuries. The lock had been broken from the inside. Metal fragments lay scattered on the floor like broken teeth. The footprints led down into the darkness below. Marcel had never been in the cellar. As a child, he had been forbidden to go near the door. His mother had told him it was dangerous, that the stairs were rotted, that old houses kept their secrets in the deep places where children should not go. He had obeyed because he was a good son, because his mother had already lost so much that he could not bear to cause her more worry. But now, 14 years later, Marcel understood that some secrets call from the darkness until they are answered. He started down the stone steps. Each step echoed in the space below. The air grew colder as he descended, carrying smells of damp stone and something else, something that reminded him of sickness, of long confinement, of a body that had not seen sunlight for too many years. The cellar was larger than he had expected. Stone walls stretched beyond the reach of his lamplight. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams that groaned softly in the silence. And in the furthest corner, behind walls that seemed newer than the rest, Marcel found room. The door to this room hung open. Inside, Marcel saw things that made his heart stop and restart like a clock that had been wound too tight. A bed with tangled sheets. A wash basin filled with stale water. Books scattered on a rough wooden table. Books he remembered from his childhood. Books that had been read until their pages were soft as cloth. Empty plates that still held crumbs. A chamber pot that had been recently used. And on the wall, carved deep into the stone with what must have been fingernails worn to blood, words that Marcel read by lamplight. "Marcel, where are you? Marcel, can you hear me? Marcel, I'm still here." The lamp trembled in Marcel's hands. The flame flickered, making the carved words seem to move like living things. His breath came in short gasps that echoed off the stone walls. His mind, trained in the logic of banks and business, could not accept what his eyes were showing him. Someone had been living in this cellar room for years. Someone who knew his name. Someone who had carved it into stone with the desperation of the truly forgotten. Marcel backed away from the room, his lamp casting wild shadows on the walls. He stumbled up the stone steps, through the hallway, out the front door into the clean air of late afternoon. He stood in the overgrown garden, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what he had seen. But as the sun began to set behind the trees, Marcel heard something that made his blood turn cold. Footsteps, slow and careful, moving through the house he had just fled. Someone was home. The village baker, old Madame Rousseau, found Marcel standing in the garden an hour later. She had brought bread, she said, as was proper when someone returned home after a long absence. But when she saw his face in the dying light, she set the bread on the garden wall and crossed herself. "Monsieur Marcel," she whispered, "you look as if you have seen the dead." Marcel stared at the darkened windows of the estate. "Madame Rousseau," he said slowly, "tell me about the bread that goes missing from your shop." The old woman's eyes widened. She glanced at the house, then back at Marcel. "How did you know?" "Tell me." "For years now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "someone takes bread in the night. Never much, just enough for one person to eat. We thought it was vagrants, or perhaps the village children playing tricks. But the bread always disappears on the same nights. And those are the nights when people report seeing lights in the windows of your family's house." Marcel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of lights?" "Small ones. Like a single candle moving from room to room. Like someone searching for something they have lost." The old woman gathered her shawl around her shoulders and hurried away, leaving the bread on the wall. Marcel stood alone in the gathering darkness, staring at the house where he had been born, where his brother had died, where something that should not exist continued to live in the deep places where light never reached. Inside the house, a single light flickered in an upstairs window, the window of the room where two boys had once slept side by side, dreaming the same dreams, sharing the same breath under the same stars. But now Marcel faced a question that would haunt him through the long night ahead. If Henri was dead and buried, who was eating the bread, and why did they know his name? Marcel did not sleep that night. He sat in the village inn, staring at a cup of wine that had grown cold hours before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the carved words on the cellar wall. Every time he tried to think of something else, he heard footsteps moving through the abandoned rooms of his childhood home. When dawn broke over Saint-Étienne-de-Bois on October 15th, 1866, Marcel walked back to the estate. The morning mist clung to the ground like the breath of ghosts. His hands shook as he unlocked the front door. The house waited in silence, holding its secrets like a mother holds a crying child, close and protective and afraid. Marcel had brought more oil lamps. He had brought food and water. He had brought a courage that felt thin as paper, but was all he could manage. The rational man he had become in Paris whispered that he was going mad, that grief and old memories were playing tricks on his mind. But the boy who had once shared breath with another soul knew better. The cellar doors stood open, just as he had left it. Marcel lit 3 lamps and carried them down the stone steps. The light pushed back the darkness, but could not chase away the cold that seemed to live in the very walls. His footsteps echoed like a heartbeat in the silence. The door to the hidden room hung on its hinges like a broken wing. Marcel stepped inside and held his lamps high. The carved words on the wall seemed to pulse in the flickering light. But now Marcel saw other things, scratches in the stone that marked the passing days, drawn in groups of 7. Hundreds of them. Years of them. Someone had been counting time in this buried place. Marcel set the lamps on the rough wooden table. He called out into the darkness beyond the room, his voice cracking like a boy's. "If someone is here, please show yourself. I'm not here to hurt you." The silence stretched long enough for Marcel to wonder if he truly had lost his mind. Then, from the deepest shadows of the cellar, came a sound like rustling leaves. A figure stepped into the circle of lamplight. Marcel's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His hand began to shake so badly that one of the lamps nearly fell. The man before him was thin as a shadow, pale as candle wax. His hair hung long and tangled around a face that looked carved from hunger and darkness. His clothes were tattered remnants of what had once been a boy's nightshirt, now hanging on a frame that had grown tall without ever growing strong. But the eyes were green as spring leaves, green as Marcel's own eyes, green as they had been 14 years ago when 2 boys had shared the same fever in the same bed. "Marcel." The voice was barely a whisper, rough from years of speaking only to silence. "Is it really you?" Marcel could not speak, could not move, could not breathe. The lamp light wavered as his hands trembled. The man before him was a stranger. The man before him was impossible. The man before him was his brother, grown old in darkness, grown strange in solitude, grown into something that should not exist. Henri Marcel whispered. The name fell from his lips like a prayer to a god he had stopped believing in. Henri stepped closer, moving like someone who had forgotten how to walk in the presence of others. His bare feet made no sound on the stone floor. "You came back," he said. "I knew you would come back. I heard your voice upstairs. I heard you walking in our room. Henri, you're—" Marcel's voice broke. "You're supposed to be dead." A smile crossed Henry's face. Not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who has heard a joke told too many times. "I thought I was dead too. For a while. When I first woke up down here, I thought this was what death felt like. Cold and dark and alone." Marcel set the trembling lamp on the table. "How long have you been alive?" Henry's laugh was like the sound of dry leaves blowing across stone. "Always. I never died, Marcel. I was sick, yes, very sick. But I woke up. I woke up in this room, in this darkness, and Mother was here. She told me I was still too sick to go upstairs. She told me I had to stay hidden until I was well." The truth hit Marcel like a physical blow. He staggered backward against the wall, his mind reeling. "Mother knew. She knew you were alive. She brought me food. She brought me books. She sang to me when the darkness felt too heavy." Henry's voice was distant, dreamy, like someone recounting a half-remembered dream. "But she never let me see the sun. She never let me see you." "Why?" The word came out as a sob. "Why would she do this to you? To us?" Henri tilted his head in a gesture that was heartbreakingly familiar. "She said the village thought I was dead. She said if they knew I was alive, they would take me away. She said if you knew I was alive, it would hurt you." His green eyes fixed on Marcel's face. "Did it hurt you? When you thought I was dead?" Marcel slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold stone floor. Tears ran down his face like rain on glass. "Every day. Every single day for 14 years. And now?" Henri asked quietly. "Does it hurt now, knowing I'm alive?" Marcel looked at his brother. This stranger, this ghost, this broken thing that had once been half of his soul. Henry's skin was white as paper from years without sunlight. His body was too thin, too fragile, like a bird that had never learned to fly. His eyes held a strange innocence, as if part of him was still the 8-year-old boy who had gone to sleep with fever and woken up in hell. "Yes," Marcel whispered. "It hurts different now. It hurts worse." Henri nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Mother hurt too. Every day she came down here, she looked a little more broken. Toward the end, she would sit with me and cry. She would hold my hand and say she was sorry over and over. But she never opened the door. She never let me out. When did she? When did Mother stop coming?" "Last winter. The snow was deep. I could hear it falling above us, could hear the wind." Henri wrapped his arms around his thin body. "She came down one last time. She was very sick. She could barely walk. She told me she was going away, and that someone would come for me eventually. She told me to wait. So you waited." "I waited. And when the house grew quiet, when no more footsteps came above me, I broke the lock. It took me weeks. My hands bled, but I broke it." Henri held up his hands, and Marcel could see the scars, white lines across his palms like a map of suffering. "And then I was free, but I didn't know how to be free." Marcel understood. How could someone who had lived in darkness for 14 years face the sun? How could someone who had known only one room learn to live in the world? "I went upstairs at night," Henri continued. "I walked through our house. I remembered things, the way your laugh sounded, the games we used to play, the dreams we shared. But everything was covered in dust. Everything was dead. So you took bread from the village. I was hungry. And bread. Bread tastes like life, doesn't it? Like the world outside this hole." Henry's eyes grew distant. "I would take the bread and come back here and eat it in the dark. And for a little while, I could pretend I was still a person." The two brothers sat in silence, the lamplight flickering between them. Marcel looked at Henri and saw 14 years of stolen time, 14 years of a life lived in shadow while he had walked in sunlight. Henri looked at Marcel and saw the brother he had dreamed of, finally returned, but changed into someone he didn't recognize. "Can you forgive me?" Marcel asked finally. "Forgive you for what?" "For living. For being free." for having a life while you. Marcel gestured at the stone walls, the makeshift bed, the scratches that marked years of counting empty days. Henri was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out with one pale, scarred hand and touched Marcel's face. His fingers were cold as winter rain. There is nothing to forgive, brother. You didn't know. You mourned me. You put flowers on my grave. But if I had looked harder, if I had questioned Mother's story, if I had come home sooner, then what? You would have ended up down here with me? You would have lived in darkness too. Henri shook his head. No. One of us had to live in the light. One of us had to be free. I'm glad it was you. Marcel caught his brother's hand and held it tight. It felt like holding a bird, all hollow bones and fragile warmth. What do we do now? How do we fix this? Henri smiled, and for a moment, Marcel could see the boy he had been, mischievous, gentle, alive with possibility. We start with sunrise, Henri said. I have been in the dark for 14 years. Perhaps it's time I remembered what the sun feels like. But even as he spoke these hopeful words, Henri's eyes held a fear that Marcel recognized, the fear of someone who had been buried so long that he wasn't sure he remembered how to be alive. The first sunrise Henri saw in 14 years brought tears that would not stop. Marcel had helped his brother climb the cellar stairs on the morning of October 16, 1866. Each step was a small victory and a small tragedy. Henri's legs, weak from years of darkness, trembled like a newborn colt's. His hand gripped Marcel's arm with desperate strength, as if letting go would send him tumbling back into the underground world that had held him prisoner. When they reached the kitchen, Marcel opened the shutters slowly. The morning light crept across the dusty floor like water, golden and warm and alive. Henri stood in the doorway, watching the light approach his bare feet with the wonder of someone seeing magic for the first time. It's beautiful, he whispered, his voice breaking. I had forgotten how beautiful it was. But when the light touched his skin, Henri screamed. His pale flesh, and used to sun for so many years, burned like paper. Red welts rose on his hands and face. He stumbled backward into the shadows, gasping, his eyes wide with pain and fear. I'm sorry, Marcel said, quickly closing the shutters. I should have thought. I should have known it would hurt. Henri sat on the kitchen floor, cradling his burned hands against his chest. Will it always hurt? Will I never be able to stand in the sun again? Marcel knelt beside his brother, his heart breaking with each pained breath Henri took. We'll take it slowly, a little light at a time. Your skin will remember how to be strong. But they both wondered if some kinds of damage could never heal. The days that followed were filled with small lessons in how to live. Marcel taught Henri to walk upstairs without his legs giving out. He showed him how to hold a fork properly. Henri's hands had forgotten the weight of silverware, the simple act of bringing food to his mouth without spilling. He helped him bathe in warm water, washing away 14 years of cellar dust and despair. Henri learned that the world had changed while he lived underground. Napoleon III ruled France now. There were trains that carried people faster than horses ever could. In Paris, wide boulevards had been built where narrow streets once stood. The village of Saint-Étienne-de-Bois had grown larger. Children who had been babies when Henri disappeared were now young men and women with children of their own. Time kept moving, Henri said one evening as they sat by candlelight in the parlor. I thought maybe it had stopped when I went into the dark, but it kept going without me. You're here now, Marcel replied, though the words felt thin and insufficient. Henri touched the scars on his palms, the marks left by breaking locks and clawing at stone walls. Am I? Sometimes I feel like I'm still down there, dreaming this. Dreaming that I have a brother who came back for me. Marcel understood. He felt the same unreality, the sense that this reunion was too fragile to be true. At night, he would wake in panic, certain that Henri had vanished, that the cellar room was empty again, that he had imagined the whole impossible thing. He would creep to Henri's bed and listen for breathing, the way their mother had once listened when they were children with fever. But Henri was always there, sleeping fitfully, sometimes crying out words that made no sense. Fragments of conversations he had held with shadows, pieces of prayers he had whispered to walls that never answered. The villagers began to whisper new stories. Old Madame Rousseau had seen two figures walking in the estate garden at twilight. Father Dubois reported that someone had been visiting Henry's grave in the cemetery, leaving fresh flowers and sitting beside the headstone for hours. The baker's wife swore she had glimpsed a pale face in the upstairs window of the Lavoie house, watching the village with eyes that held too much sadness for the living. "They think we're both ghosts now," Marcel told Henri as they shared bread and soup one gray afternoon. Autumn rain drummed against the windows, washing the dust from glass that had been dark for too long. Henri lifted a spoonful of soup to his lips with careful concentration. His hands still shook, but less than they had a week before. "Maybe we are. Maybe this is what ghosts do. Sit in empty houses and remember being alive." "Do you want to remember?" Marcel asked. "Or would it be easier to forget?" Henri was quiet for a long time, watching the rain trace paths down the window pane. "I remember everything. Every day in that room. Every hour of darkness. Every time I carved your name in the wall, hoping somehow you would hear me." He looked at Marcel with green eyes that held too much knowledge. "But I also remember before. I remember when we were whole. Were we ever whole? Or did we just think we were because we didn't know what broken felt like? We were 7 years old, Marcel. We caught fireflies in jars and thought we had captured stars. We believed that if one of us was hurt, the other would feel it too. We slept in the same bed and dreamed the same dreams." Henry's voice grew soft with memory. "If that isn't whole, then maybe whole is just something children believe in before the world teaches them better." Marcel reached across the table and took his brother's scarred hand. "Then let's be children again, just for a moment." They sat in silence, holding hands across a wooden table in a house that had known too much sorrow. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the autumn leaves from the trees, preparing the world for winter. But something had changed between them. The desperate fear of the first days was softening into something quieter, not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of peace. Henry's hands had stopped trembling quite so much. He could look at bright candlelight without flinching. He had learned to sleep without crying out in the night. And Marcel had begun to forgive himself for the 14 years he had lived while Henri suffered. "I want to visit my grave," Henri said suddenly. Marcel looked up, startled. "Why?" "I want to see it. The place where everyone thought I was sleeping. I wanted to say goodbye to the boy who died there. The boy I was before the cellar." The next day, they walked to the cemetery together. It was Henry's first time outside the estate since his resurrection. He wore Marcel's clothes, which hung loose on his thin frame. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face from the weak autumn sun. He moved slowly, stopping often to rest, marveling at the feel of grass beneath his feet and wind on his skin. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the village. Henry's grave was in the family plot, marked with a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his too short life. Henri Lavoie, 1844 to 1852, beloved son and brother. Henri knelt beside the grave and placed his hand on the stone. "Hello," he whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay dead for you." Marcel stood behind his brother, tears streaming down his face. "The flowers," he said. "All these years, I brought you flowers. I know. Sometimes when the wind was right, I could smell them down in the cellar. Roses and lavender. The scent would find its way through the cracks in the stones." Henri traced the carved letters of his name with one finger. "Thank you for remembering me even when you thought I was gone." They stayed at the grave until sunset, two brothers mourning the children they had been and the man one of them had never had the chance to become. But as they walked home through the purple twilight, something lifted from their shoulders, not the weight of their tragedy, but the crushing loneliness that had made it unbearable. "What happens now?" Henri asked as they reached the estate. Marcel looked at the house where they had been born, where one had lived and one had been buried alive, where they had found each other again against all hope. "I don't know. But whatever happens, we face it together." Henri nodded, and for the first time since Marcel had found him in the cellar, he smiled a real smile, not the broken grimace of someone who had forgotten how, but the warm expression of someone who had remembered what it meant to be loved. The rain began to fall again as they entered the house, washing the world clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. And in that moment, watching his brother hang his hat on the same hook where it had hung 20 years before, Marcel understood that some choices echo through time, not as curses, but as chances for grace, opportunities to learn that love, even love that makes terrible mistakes, can sometimes find its way back to the light. Behind them, the village settled into evening, no longer whispering about ghosts and curses, but about two brothers who had found their way home to each other across 14 years of darkness, carrying between them the fragile, precious possibility that even the most broken things could learn to be whole again.